So why are OTAs so useful? Stick around and we're going to talk about just that. But first, good evening, Agile acquisition enthusiasts. Welcome back to the Underground Digital Tiki Bar. It's Friday night, and that means it's time for another episode of Agile Acquisitions and Alcohol. Cheers. All right. Welcome back to part two of our three-part series on other transaction authority. In the last video, we talked about the history and the origins of other transaction authority and how it got to be so popular and commonplace today. And on this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about why is it so useful. So other transaction authority is non-FAR based authority. And what that means is when you look at the Code of Federal Regulations, within that you have the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which is approximately 2,500 pages of rules and provisions and clauses that have to be included in FAR-based contracts. And along with that, you have a lot of case law and policy and practices that have just sort of built up over time and has made the acquisition process rather complex, as you might know. Well, the idea is that other transaction authority being outside of the FAR means that essentially you have a clean slate. It's not that the FAR is necessarily difficult to operate. It's all of those other things that go along with the years and decades of FAR-based contracting that has made the execution of FAR contracting so very difficult. But when you have the other transaction authority, instead of trying to figure out how would we improve something, you have a chance to start with sort of a blue sky. How would you do acquisitions if there weren't all of these rules in place? So that's exactly what the other transaction authority gives you. It gives an agreements officer, who is typically a contracting officer, the ability to come up with an acquisition strategy that makes the most sense for their users. Remember, at the beginning of the day, contracting officer, agreement officer, contract specialist, they're all just business advisors. They should be thinking of how can they best support their customers to get the job of bringing in a vendor to support a need as easy and most effectively and efficiently as possible. So that's what other transaction can allow them to do. Now, oftentimes that means you have to come up with a process. So under FAR contracting, under FAR 16, you have all your different contract types. Other transaction authority doesn't have it. As I mentioned in the previous video, commercial solutions openings, or CSOs, are commonly used, and those look very similar to the BAA. But the good thing about that is when you think about FAR-based contracting, in order to remove a vendor from an acquisition, you have to fully evaluate them or fully consider them. And that means evaluating price. Well, as you know, in order to evaluate price, you need all the detail that goes along with it. That's actually usually the long pole in the tent. Under other transaction authority, you don't have that obligation. So you have the ability to run a down select acquisition, evaluate vendors based on their technical approach, and then determine based on that which vendors are most likely to be successful in the overall acquisition, remove the ones that don't, down select to a competitive pool, and then you can start focusing deeper on the acquisition requirements, including ultimately getting to a price. Sometimes in other transaction acquisitions, you'll do a down select and then you'll still have a technical challenge or a technical exchange. And this is where you bring in industry and you have them compete amongst each other against a technical challenge and then evaluate the capabilities that they deliver. Or you bring them in and you have a technical team have a very in-depth discussion. This addresses another challenge that's often faced in FAR-based competitions, where contracting officers don't like to have an open dialogue for fear of protest and unfair advantage. Under other transaction authority, you can do that. Bring them in, have that open dialogue, and determine which vendor is most likely to deliver the best overall capability. From there, oftentimes you'll select the vendor that you think you're going to award to. Oftentimes you'll notify the second or third that if negotiations are not successful, you may come back to them. And you enter into what I like to call alpha negotiations or deep negotiations, where you work through what are the full requirements, what is the full pricing. If you can reach agreement on all that, you make an award and you have your best valid candidate for this opportunity. So those are some of the inner workings of how it's often executed and why it offers so much value. A lot of times other transaction authorities are run by consortiums or a contractor that's essentially a broker that's been hired to run the other transaction acquisition on behalf of the federal government. They will go through all the same processes, but they'll just be a sort of a intermediary between the two, and they run through that process. And that's really helpful when the government might not have the experience or the acquisition resources to run an other transaction acquisition themselves. Either way, the idea is streamlining and being efficient based on how would you best do an acquisition given the opportunity to do it the way you think. So that's why other transactions so valuable. Again, as I mentioned before, you also have the sole source follow-on for operational deployment that was authorized in NDA 2016. And that, of course, has a lot of value because you can move seamlessly from a prototype pilot initiative to the operational deployment. So there you go, part 2 of the series, why are other transactions so useful? In the next episode in this series, we'll talk about where to find other transaction opportunities, how to get involved with them, and how to respond. So hope this was helpful. If it was, give me a thumbs up, subscribe so you're notified when the next episode comes out. And until next week, cheers.